cutting the time short because there'll be times when I'll be searching for
exactly
baloney to talk about.
Actually, I'm going to be standing on this side. I think it would be better if I
Yeah, I think it would, but I didn't know whether you could or not.
No, I was trying to balance it off of that. Okay, Bob, if you're not a junior, are you?
No, my son is a junior.
Okay, great. Okay, why don't you start about the time, start back as early
Have you got it on now?
It's running.
Okay.
And let us know a little bit about...
Well, let's see. My name's Robert Earl Noell. I'm 57 years old. I was born in the state of Virginia, and I live in Ozona, Florida now, which is in Pinellas County on the west coast, on the water, the Gulf of Mexico, and the beautiful St. Joseph Sound here behind me. And I live about 2.5 miles from the chimp farm. The chimp farm is owned by my parents. And I was born in the amusement business. I was born in the vaudeville show days. My parents were vaudeville show people, and my father left home when he's about 12 years old. Went with Sam Doc. Went with Doc Etling first. Doc Etling took him on a horse and buggy, and he was a magician. And then he met my mother, which was born in the amusement business also, in the vaudeville show business. My mother and father got married, and about somewhere along in the 30s they bought animals. They had a number of different animals. And about 1939 they bought the first chimpanzee. His name was Snooky. Snooky was one of the family. I grew up with Snooky. Snooky, let's go back through Snooky again?
Yeah, let's hold it. Okay, so that was in 1939, my parents.
Yeah, about 1939 they bought the first chimpanzee in New Orleans, Louisiana. His name was Snooky.
Okay, look, let's start out so we can use that as a cut line. Saying I was in the vaudeville business, and my parents were in the vaudeville business. Okay.
Yeah, my parents were in the amusement business and the vaudeville show business, and my mother was born in the business, and my father started when he was about 12, and they bought the first chimpanzee. They got into animals in 1939 in New Orleans, Louisiana. They bought Snooky. Snooky was a chimpanzee about 3 or 4 years old, 2, 3, 4 years, about 4 years old when they bought him, when they first got Snooky. I remember when my father brought him home, he became one of the family, stayed right in the trailer with us, and I kind of grew up with Snooky. We used to play together. My father couldn't give me a whipping. Snooky would raise Cain if Daddy gave me a whipping. I got along real well with Snooky. Snooky looked after me probably better than a big brother would. That's no joke. Snooky and me were the best of friends. Snooky was really one of the family. He wasn't really. Of course, he couldn't go every place we went, but he went a lot of places we went. He'd go in the car. He wore his clothes when he'd go with us in the car. And carried a little pot along for Snooky. If Snooky had to go, he'd let you know, and he'd get them britches off, and he'd look for that little pot. Had a lot of experiences with Snooky. I was in New Orleans, Louisiana. We wintered along the levee near the Huey P. Long Bridge, and there used to be a lot of willows growing along there. And my father tied Snooky to one of the little willow trees on a long cow chain, about a 20, 30-foot long cow chain. And he was the other side of the levee from where my father parked the house trailers and the trucks. And they went off one day and left Snooky tied over there and told me, don't go over there near the river because I might fall in the river. But they were gone, and so sure enough, I went over the other side of the levee and was playing with Snooky, and it was a steep embankment as I remember it. I remember it being some asphalt there, and it was slippery, and I wound up sliding down that little bit of asphalt. And maybe it was a mud bank, but I remember it being asphalt. And there was no way for me to get the bank. But Snooky, seeing me in trouble, he had the cow chain to hold on to, so he came down the bank and gave me his foot. Now the chimps are scared of water. They don't like water so much. But he gave me his foot and pulled me up out of it, and and I never even told anybody for 5 years or more, because I had no business going over there, and if I'd have told him, I might have gotten a whipping. So nobody even knew about that story except me and Snooky. But Snooky pulled me out of the Mississippi River there at the Huey P. Long Bridge. That happened. It's possible. It possibly did save my life. Many stories with Snooky. I used to play with Snooky through the bars, and if he'd take a ring off my hand or something like that when I'd play with him through the bars, he wouldn't give it back to me unless I'd get him something that he wanted. You know, if he'd go get him a stick of chewing gum or something, and I could barter with him. He'd give me my ring back if I give him the stick of chewing gum. We'd play together when he was outside, and he'd push me in a wagon, I'd push him in a wagon, and when I learned to ride a bicycle, actually, he could ride on the back of the bicycle with me. And I don't know, there's a lot of experiences to go back. I'm going back a long time. Remember, I'm 57 now. We bought Snooky in 39, so I wasn't too old when we bought Snooky, and then we kind of grew up together. Then, of course, when I got married, my children grew up with the second generation of chimps. Now my grandchildren are growing up with the third generation of chimps. So, and the same is true on my sister, with my sister. Her children and her grandchildren are actually growing up with the chimps too. Third generation, like my boys. My boys aren't around them near as much as my sister's children and grandchildren. But they call them man-like apes, and believe me, they are man-like, because they're real close to being human. I used to sleep in the cage truck on a bunk, and on a cool night, I've actually pulled a Congo up in the bed with me on a cool night, and he'd snuggle up to me. He was a young animal at the time, and a lot of experiences with chimpanzees growing up with them. I can come on track there. My father had animals, had a number of different type of animals when he bought Snooky, and he used to play little schools around the different parishes in Louisiana, around New Orleans. I went to McDonough 11 there at one school in New Orleans, but he had this little truck that had like bars or a screen wire on both sides, and the larger cage in the truck was so people could look into the and see the animals. Now, what he'd do, he'd bring a small cage into the big cage and take the animal out, well, if he was in the South, people in the South had never seen a badger, so if you brought a badger, and you could lecture on a badger and different animals, and most of them would be domestic animals. And if you got a little further up the line, people hadn't seen armadillos, so if you took an armadillo into Virginia, well, that was a curiosity thing, you know. So he'd lecture on these animals, and then he'd bring that way if the animal was loose, it'd be in the big cage, it couldn't get away because he's in a big cage where the people was looking at him. Then he'd put the animal back in the small cage, set the small cage out of the big cage, and bring another small cage in and lecture on the next animal. Take it out of the cage, handle it, and run around in the big cage with him. Well, Snooky got where he didn't want to go back in the small cage. He wanted to be playing in a big cage. So my father had a hard time putting Snooky in the little cage. So finally one night he couldn't get Snooky in the cage, and someone in the audience says, well, I'll help you put that monkey in that box. So my father said, all right, come in and have a try at it. Well, it turned out to be a pretty good show. So we kind of featured that someone was going to go in the cage and see if he could put the monkey in the box. Well, this went on for quite a while, and then Snooky, as he got a little older, he started nipping, biting a little bit, so my father had to devise a muzzle for him. So then if a big man came in and Snooky really didn't feel like putting up a tussle, he'd run in the box. So if he ran in the box, of course, that wasn't much of a show. So then they said, well, okay, you have to put Snooky's shoulders on the floor, and it became a wrestling match. So Snooky didn't like the idea of anybody trying to put his shoulders on the floor. He had two bars in the top of the cage that he could swing on, and we had bars on each side. We had modernized and got a little bigger and better cage wagon. The main cage wagon was built in '46 in New Orleans, and the the chimp would be with bars on both sides where people looking in, 2 bars in the top of the cage and a big tire bolted in one end of the cage for the chimp to set on. So it turned into a full-fledged wrestling matches, and the way it worked, and the chimp really enjoyed it. And then they bought another chimp, and they had a little pole where they could look through and see each other. So one would teach the other one anything one learned. The other one would know how to do what to do when he came in. So the regular routine was, and no 2 shows were exactly alike. All the shows were different, and because no 2 people are alike, some people went in with thinking they were really going to do something. Some people went in with the idea of playing with the animal. But it was play for the animal regardless. But the animal would be turned loose in the big cage, and the crowd would gather on both sides, and we'd charge 50 cents or 75 cents or $1 to see the show, depending on who was going in the cage. My father would go in the cage, put the muzzle on the animal. We'd put on the man a football helmet and tie it on with shoestring so it wouldn't come off. At Goodwill had shirts, white shirts that you could buy for 5 and 10 cents a piece, so we put a white shirt on the man so he wouldn't mess his shirt up. And when he went into the cage, if he was going in and was going to be a rough individual, which you can tell beforehand by the actions and the talk, and if he's going to be a rough individual, then my father would kind of, after he was standing in the middle of the cage, the man comes in the door at one end, Snooky's sitting on a tire at the other end. Then my father would say, "Okay, are you ready?" to the man. And he'd say, "Yeah, I'm ready." So my father would step to a corner. Well, when my father would step to the corner, the animal would reach out into the top of the cage and grab one of the bars in the top of the cage. Now, he was long-armed, so therefore he was almost better than a third of the way to the man when he reached the bar, out from the bar. The man would take a step or 2 away from the end of the cage. The chimp would swing out on one arm, meeting the man with both feet and one arm. He would grab the man usually by the back of the helmet. The helmet, of course, will not come off because it's tied on with shoestrings. The man's feet almost then clears the floor. The crowd doesn't see this, but the man's being held up by the chimp holding him by the back of the helmet. At the same time, he's swinging towards the man with both little short back feet. The back feet hitting the man in the stomach. The chimp also at the same time butts the man with the top of his head in his snoot. The people in the crowd didn't realize what was happening. It happened so fast. In a matter of 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds, the chimp's turned the man loose. The man had the wind completely knocked out of him, been butted harder than a billy goat would butt you, and then the chimp shoves him up against the end of the steel cage, and the chimp swings right back over, sits on the tire, and the man has just about had all he can stand. He doesn't really want any more. But his friends out in the audience said, "Oh, Bill, you almost got him. Get him again, Bill." Well, Bill really don't want no more of that monkey, but he's done told his friends what all he's going to do. So maybe he'll take one more shot. Maybe he'll come back out towards the animal one more time. The animal's apt to come down on the floor next time and grab him by the foot and take it to the top of the cage, which was standard procedure, either a foot going to the top of the cage or by his belt, or grab him by the arm and pull him and then shove him back against the end of the cage. But about 15, 20 seconds of action was all that a show usually lasted. Then somebody in the crowd, that said, "Oh, I can do better than that." Well, we let everybody go outside and we just put on a free show, either a free moving picture show that lasted about 15 minutes, or a magic show, or some type of vaudeville show. And then we'd charge again to go back in and see the other guy go in the cage. And this went on. It went on for 25 or so years. I don't know, maybe 30 years. It went on from the early 40s, right on up till about 15, 18, 20 years ago. And like I say, no 2 shows.
Noel's interview, May the 12th, 1992,
Part 2,
Part 2, Take 2.
in Ozona, Florida, on the St. Joseph Sound.
St. Joseph Sound, on the beautiful west coast here.
Somebody's ringing my doorbell. The wife will get it, I hope.
Okay. Let this run here about 20 seconds. It's hot, the sun's out.
On the sun porch,
On the sun porch. What a beautiful,
300 Bay Street, Ozona.
beautiful, beautiful view out here.
On now?
We're rolling.
Well, we're in Ozona, Florida. Let's see, where do we pick up at? We were in a wrestling match with the chimps.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's see. Snooky, of course, was the first, and Snooky kind of trained the chimps that came along behind Snooky.
Now let's elaborate on that a little bit. Actually, they talk about the training. I mean, I find that pretty remarkable that one animal can teach another animal. That's a sure sign of intelligence. And
Well, they've got more intelligence than you think.
well, it used to be the standard, saying that. Hold on.
I mean, some things is really interesting, but they're real interesting. They'll probably be run someplace. We'll have to get into harangues on that one story, though. But we're in chimps right now, and chimps, Snooky in the wrestling matches, actually, 3 men at a time couldn't put Snooky in a box if he didn't want to go in the box. I've seen three big men at a time go in with Snooky. I've seen all kinds of situations. I've seen people go in there that really thought they were going to mop up on that little monkey, and that little monkey just stomped the daylights out of them, The 100-pound chimp in his own environment, there's no way. And when he's in the cage with bars over his head so he can swing on them, he's in his environment. He can, there's no match. Two men, there's no way that two men could go in there and be any type of match. I don't care if they were 200 pounds apiece, and the chimp weigh 100 pounds. No match. The chimp just, very seldom do I ever see the chimp get in a squirmy situation where maybe the guy is really locked in on his foot or something and he really squirms to get his foot loose. Very seldom do I ever see that. I have seen it.
Was it a test of strength, or was it cunning and strength?
Way he's in his environment, and you're off balance. He's got a handle on the back of your head with that football helmet, and they can grab things on you and they come off. He grab your britches and pull off, well, the show's over. And I've seen it happen probably in hundreds of times where they pull the britches off, where a guy's standing there with no britches on. When the chimp grabs the britches at the bottom in the pants leg, the weakest seam in pants seemingly was always the center seam that ran up through the crotch and back down the other leg. And I've seen men standing in there a lot of times with that stitching tore out all the way around, so they have a short skirt on, and they don't realize it, but they don't have anything. When they bend over, their crowd is out there laughing, and they don't really know why, because they're excited with what they're doing with the chimp. But the chimp has all of the advantages in that environment where he's in the cage and can swing around over top of your head and then come down on the floor with you too if he wants to, and take your foot to the top of the cage. A human being just can't do something like that, and if he did with a chimp, it wouldn't make any difference. The chimp would be upside down. It would be just about as comfortable as right side up, where the man is completely off balance. Well, let's touch on a couple of things you haven't touched on. Anybody ever get hurt in the cage?
That's a good idea.
Nobody seriously. I've seen
Let's start again. Just say nobody seriously.
nobody seriously hurt in the cage. I've seen some arms pulled out of socket. My father would put them back in socket usually. With the chimp pulled out, and his elbow, not his elbow, but his shoulder would get a hump up on it or something like that, and pulling him on the arm occasionally. I think one man sat down on his ankle and broke his ankle one time. I think that was about the only broken bone I've seen. It bites. They bite. If a person put their hand in the cage when the chimp didn't have a muzzle on it, which the show was designed so a person couldn't get to the cage on the outside, that was held back by a fence at about 5 foot of distance. But occasionally a big person would reach over and or something like that. And the chimp will bite your fingers. They bite if you're outside the cage and they're inside the cage. So I've seen that happen. Going to the, what was the other subject you?
Day-to-day life.
Well, day-to-day life with chimps, of course, it's a everyday, 365-day-a-year situation, because it's like having a shut-in or something. You have to be there with them all the time, and finally you get to know every noise that they make. And I slept in the cage wagon for years. I had a bunk in the cage wagon. I would know which one snored and what each one wanted, when they wanted it, and they let you know what they want too. They'll pick up an orange peel or something like that and wave it at you. Well, he wants something like an apple or an orange or something, and then you just say to them, "You want an apple?" Oh, then they say, "Oh, yeah." They don't say it that way. They say, they let you know, "Yeah, I want an apple," or "Yeah, get me something." So you go get them something, and it was fixed so we had things where they could get the water. We just filled a little thing up where they could suck the water anytime they wanted it. Some of them were extremely clean, and some of them weren't so clean. Snooky was extremely clean, probably because he was raised up in the trailer and taught in the trailer that he had to use a pot. And of course, when he's put in his own cage, the cages had sawdust in them, and he'd go in the corner and cover it up, and he had a little tin can. He'd go in a tin can, and Daddy would dump the tin can. And yeah, but now some of them weren't like that, but probably because they weren't taught that way from the beginning, and so some of them wasn't as clean as others.
Kind of go into what we
Yeah, well, let's see, we showed, of course, in the South in the summertime. In the wintertime we showed in the wintertime we showed in the southern states, Texas, Louisiana, Florida. And in the winter of 48, 49, I believe we stayed in Miami. And about 1949, 50, we came to Pinellas County. And we showed around this area. We showed on the Clearwater-Largo Road one week in Largo. And one of my jobs was to get the people lined up to go in the cage with the animals. So when you got girls to go in the cage, it drawed a better crowd. It wasn't necessarily a good show because it wasn't a rough show, but people wanted to see the girls go in the cage. So in Largo, I talked some girls into going in the cage with Snooky, to play with Snooky. And one of them, his name was Gene Overstreet. And we wound up wintering in the Clearwater area, and I wound up marrying Gene Overstreet about 42 years ago. and we stayed out near the Kapok Tree Inn at that time. That was just before they bought the place here at Tarpon that they have that they have now, and started wintering there ever since. But I've lost myself now. I got to come back to that. Cut it off a second. So me and the wife, of course, we had a little show. We had a semi. My father bought a semi trailer, and we had a lot of extra animals in it. So we had a two semi show then, the one with a big cage wagon and another one for an exhibit. And me and the wife had a living quarters in the front of the number 2 semi, and the animals in the back. And after several years of that, and a couple of children, I wanted to kind of get away and get on my own, so I built a thing where you hit and ring the bell, a thing called a high striker. And me and the wife kind of ventured off on our own that was somewhere along about 1953 or so. And we went with the James E. Strait shows. We caught them in Rochester, New York. And I spent about 9 years with the James E. Strait shows on the eastern seaboard, playing up and down the Raleigh Fair, the Hamburg County Fair in New York, Syracuse Fair, Winston-Salem, Albany, Georgia, Orlando, all of the spots that James E. Strait shows went to. And then about 9 years after we joined the Strait shows, the pasture looked greener the Midwest, so I joined the Royal American shows, and we went on the Royal American route. And at that time, I had a few more concessions. I built water games. I manufactured games. I got to be a pretty good manufacturer and well recognized throughout the industry for water games. And our route carried us to St. Louis, let's see, Memphis, St. Louis, Davenport, Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, Regina, Milwaukee, St. Paul, Topeka, Hutchinson, Little Rock, Jackson, Shreveport, back home to Tampa, and then the February fair at the Tampa State Fair of Florida. And we showed to millions of people every year. But when I got away from the animals, we don't have any animals. I cleaned cages and took care of animals for a number of years there, and so now I feel a little freer. You're tied down when you have animals. You can't do anything that doesn't include the animals. You can't go on a trip. You can't. So when I got away from the animals, I don't have any animals. We're not tied down now. Last July I was in Australia, and this July I'm going to be up in Pikes Peak and race day up there and staying in the motorhome just to, it's the only night you can spend on Pikes Peak, race day. And so we do a little bit of traveling now. It was my second trip to Australia. And we're taking it easy. I'm just about retired now. I have a little shop going at my son. We still manufacture a game, and we have them in a number of locations, from Chicago to Texas. We make them and put them out on locations and sell a few of them, called the Lax Rotary game. It's a merchandise game where people win prizes, and we put them in places like bus terminals, some airports, bowling alleys. Yeah. Going back in the 40s, we used to show the little Carolina and Virginia towns, and we used to show little towns like Pungo and Lowland and Chinquapin, and little towns that in some of the places back like Aurora, small store. Little towns that had a store and didn't have electricity. Not even the store had electricity. The dirt roads. And we'd drive maybe to Kinston or someplace to the ice house and bring back a couple of blocks of ice, and I'd shave ice to show it down that we haven't showed. And that covers all the eastern seaboard. We didn't hit a lot in New Jersey. We didn't hit metropolitan areas or where there was a lot of people. We stayed mainly where there was a lot of dirt roads and wasn't too much electricity and stuff like that. And so we were the entertainment. There used to be lots of little family shows like that. Little family shows where little magicians, and there was little traveling tent shows that put on moving picture shows on the old Tom Mix and movies, and of course they all faded out when television came in. They kind of faded out. But we went on a little longer than most because it was audience participation with the animals, so it was more of interest. But we had free shows on the stage to draw the people, charged people to go in and see the animals wrestling box with one of their local people, and then free show back out on the stage or a movie. And then we'd maybe have a candy pitch, sell some candy, and some of the boxes had prizes in them, and you could win the blanket or the clock or whatever, and all the prizes were given away that were on display. If they bought all the candy, all the prizes went out.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut right
On now?
Yeah.
Yeah, those little towns that I remember all of them real well. We used to show back in the 40s and the 50s, and we showed just about all of them in the state of Florida too, including Key West and Marathon and all around the Miami area, all around the center of the state. We didn't get much up in the Panhandle, but anywhere from Jacksonville south to Key West, and including Cuba. We even took the show over to Cuba and showed Cuba. And it was an experience. We showed Marathon. That was about 38 years ago. They had a couple of stores, a little cafe, and I think there was a theater in Marathon at that time. There used to be a lot of theaters in smaller towns because it was the only entertainment. Again, see, there wasn't television. You know, it was the only entertainment that people had. And went on up, worked our way up the eastern seaboard, up through Georgia. You know, I don't know, Folkestone, Waycross, Ludowici, and worked our way on up in South Carolina, North Carolina, and then in Virginia. And maybe we turn around in Virginia, or maybe we turn around up in Pennsylvania. Showed all the little towns in Pennsylvania at one time or another, too. Little towns around all the Buffalo area, Lockport. And it's hard to remember all those little towns now, but nice little towns. Really, growing up that way is a little different. It gives you a little different education. Education was something that most kids think of going to school every day. Well, I didn't have all of those luxuries. I went to a lot of schools. I went to a school a week at a time. I went to many schools in Carolinas and Virginias. I didn't get many report cards. Just went to the next grade. It may have held back in some respects, but financially I did all right. I've operated and managed some good-sized businesses that I've owned. 20, 30 trucks on the road at a time, moving across the United States, and was able to get them all where they were going and get everything up, and never missed a spot. About 20 years of working, never missed a spot. Even if I had a truck wreck, we'd go back and get it and bring it in. I only had a couple of them wrecked. And 20, 30, 40 people at times employed. Worked hard, many hours. Harder than most people could ever imagine. When you work till Saturday night, say, and you start tearing the show down at 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, you get everything loaded at 4:30, and maybe you'll sleep for 2 hours, and maybe you'll get right in a vehicle and go head out to the next spot. I remember tearing down in Clearfield, Pennsylvania one time and jumping to Ionia, Michigan, which is about a 500-mile jump. And I tore down Saturday night and opened Sunday evening, and that's a hard jump. Usually you have more time than that, but that was a straight get in there and get set up and go to work. Usually, though, you have a couple of days to get the move done and set up. Sometimes you have 4 or 5 days. We went with circuses too. Circuses move every day. That's a different life, interesting life. I think everybody, if they could take one summer with a circus for just a couple of months, it would be an experience that they'd always remember the rest of their life. I'd like to add that
Let's wait a minute, because after I stop
Okay.
the step, I've got to wait.
Okay. There's a big difference in circuses. Tent circuses is where you'd get an education. There is circuses that play auditoriums. Circuses that play auditoriums is not like a tent circus. Tent circus, like the Carson and Barnes, moves every day. That circus has been going out for over 50 years, and it circles the United States almost every year. And they move every day, 2 shows a day, in small towns, in rural areas, and large cities too, but mainly small towns. And they have a number of elephants and large animals and a nice-sized menagerie, and a good circus, 3-ring circus. It's a life that's unique and different. I'd like to cut it off a second, can you? Sure. Will it start again? Yeah, as mentioned earlier, that is it on? Will it take a second to warm up?
No, we're set.
Okay. That I married a Clearwater girl, and so I kind of made Clearwater my home and lived in Clearwater and still own the old home place. My wife's a real Florida cracker. Her great-grandparents were attacked by the Indians in the Zephyr Hills area. Then I built a house here about 10 years ago that we're on right now in Ozona, Florida, which is a beautiful village in Pinellas County on the Gulf of Mexico. This behind me is on St. Joseph Sound, and the Gulf of Mexico adjoins St. Joseph Sound. Always a little activity out there, the boats and the fishermen and the birds. That island that you see behind me in the wintertime will have 200 pelicans on it. Many other birds. Beautiful place here, and quiet village and wonderful people. A real good place to call home. click it again. We'll shade that thing and I'll talk to you then.
Where's that?
Yeah, the beautiful Ozona, the Pinellas County. God, I'm still lost. I don't know what to say here. Hold on a minute.
That's all right.
Yeah, we was talking about Congo. Congo was born in Miami in 1949, I believe, when we wintered in Miami. And the zoo being only a couple of miles from my house where we're at here in Ozona, I go up there quite often and see the animals. Kind of makes me feel bad, though, to go by and see some of them, like Congo. Congo is still there, and he's one of the family, and I would like to bring him home with me, and it kind of makes me really feel guilty for not being able to just bring Congo home with me. But of course you can't do that with a big chimp. I went by and visited him the other day, and we hugged each other through the bars there, and kind of put a tear in my eye to not be able to bring Congo home and have him running around the house. But it just doesn't. When you've got a big chimp, they have to wind up in places like zoos, because it's just the way it is. You know, they can be extremely dangerous if they wanted to bite you. My father, Congo's